Good evening, Chambers. This is Corey Shirtliff checking in. If you can hear me, we cannot hear you on Zoom land. Um, Carolyn, can you hear me?
Hi, Corey. Yeah, I can hear you, but I also can't hear the chambers.
How about now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
we were muted. Okay, let's try this again. I call to order this May 8th, 2025 meeting of the Moab City Planning Commission at 6:04 p.m. In attendance, we have city staff, Kelsey Garcia, Corey Shirtleff, Johanna Blanco, as well as Alexi Lamb in the audience. We have planning commissioners, myself, Kai Marienfeld, Miles Lofton, and Jill Tatton here in person, and then Carolyn Conant joining us virtually on Zoom this evening. All right, first item of business is citizens to be heard. I do not believe we have anyone in chambers or received anything through the city's comment portal or email. So we can move on from that. Next item of business is approval of minutes from our last meeting, our April 24th, 2025 regular meeting. Minutes are linked there in the agenda. If everyone has had a chance to look over those, we can entertain a motion or make amendments if we need to.
Make a motion to approve the minutes from the April 24th, 2025 regular meeting of the City Planning Commission.
Okay, we have a motion to approve the minutes from Carolyn
I'll second that.
and a second from Miles. Any discussion or amendments? All right, all in favor of approving the minutes from our April 24th regular meeting, please say aye.
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 All right. Minutes approved 4-0. Next item of business on our agenda is a public hearing. We will open the public hearing, see if anyone is here to make comments for the public hearing. And then when we've finalized our discussion, I will close the public hearing, just if anyone is listening, hoping to chime in. This is item 4.1, a public hearing, consideration, and possible recommendation of ordinance 2025-07, an ordinance amending the Moab Municipal Code, Title 16 subdivisions to comply with land use authority designations and resulting final Mylar plat signature authorizations, removing the City of Moab Planning Commission and City Council from this portion of our code. Again, this is a public hearing, a briefing, and then a possible action. I will now open the public hearing on this item at 6:07 p.m. And then kick it off to staff to go ahead and explain the agenda item whenever you're ready.
All right. Thank you, Commission. Appreciate your patience and flexibility with me participating remotely tonight up at the APA Utah Planning Conference, bringing a lot of great materials back to us. But for tonight, my presentation, I think, just will be quite short in the review. I think I will go ahead and share our redlined draft ordinance. Just for sake of brief presentation, is that showing up for you all right?
Yep.
Okay, so as it was described in the agenda title for the item, it's really quite straightforward. In our recent subdivision ordinance amendment that we processed in response to the last 2 consecutive years of state legislation and updates resulting from that, we were confined to very particular parameters within our consulting attorney's update, where there were a number of things that we would like to additionally change with our ordinance, specific to the subdivision ordinance, that were not within the purview of what we could have handled within that original ordinance. There's still a number of other additional things we'll probably come back to at some point, but these were the most acute that we wanted to essentially process and have our ordinance become much more living and responsive document than something that remains antiquated for a long series of time and just consecutively builds discrepancies or non-conforming elements. So this is, again, our just going through the process, public process to make these changes which are really quite clear in that as the land use authority has been amended as a part of those Senate and House bills over the last 2 years, shifting land use authority and administrative land use authority, the ILUA. The Planning Commission and City Council are no longer bodies that review some of these administrative actions for platting exercises. Therefore, as we've had a couple of these go through the administrative process, we are getting to the Mylar plat where our code still required signature authorization by bodies that didn't even review the documents anymore. This is something I had checked in with our legal review, and they said, no, we just need to go back and change our code. It was not something that we could have done administratively with the code, given the other updates. So that's all we're doing right now. We are maintaining the signature authorities of those that still do process this application.
Oop,
Did we lose them?
Corey froze.
Yep.
Corey, you froze, just so you know, if you can hear us.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, we can hear you
That
now.
was my meeting blip that usually does happen, but as the host, I can just keep going. This would kick me all the way off. So it says that I'm still sharing.
Whoa.
Is it sharing with you guys?
It just kicked off and it just
Okay.
kicked you off as the host, so we only see one Corey now.
Okay, good. Well, anyway, we don't need to share again. I'll really simplify it. We're just removing those signature authorities, but maintaining the authorities that still do process those approvals. So I'll kind of leave it at that from the staff briefing. Open up to any questions or additional public comment.
Great. Do we have anyone here? There are some folks online that aren't staff or planning commissioners. I'm wondering if anyone is here for this public hearing or for later items.
I believe both in the Zoom world are for later items.
Okay, great. We still don't have anyone in chambers and we still have not received anything via email. So I will go ahead and close the public hearing at 6:12 p.m. And then we can ask questions if there's any further discussion. Otherwise, we can entertain a motion on the possible action item this evening.
I mean, it seems incredibly straightforward. We don't review these documents. Why they would require a signature from us does not make any sense.
Your conformance and updates. Yep,
Yeah, just cleaning up code.
let's go for it then.
So I would like to make a motion if everybody feels good about that.
Sure.
I motion to approve the redlined amendments to Moab Municipal Code Title 16, including any direct changes to the text from the Planning Commission. Wait, I was hoping that would be basically a pre-made motion, but
No, it's not. There isn't one in the summary this time.
all right, let me rethink for 30 seconds then.
You can just say you recommend ordinance 2025 and ordinance amending and read the title of the item on the agenda.
Yes, thank you. Sorry about
Okay.
that. The staff report was maintained from the original ordinance update, which was drafted from our legal team, which didn't follow our standard drafting. Apologize about that. Thanks for being flexible with making that motion. But yeah, I think Kaya, the way you framed it is perfect. Thank you.
Nope, that's perfect. I just wanted to make sure I was motioning for the right thing. Okay, so I would like to make a motion to recommend an approval of ordinance 2025-07, an ordinance amending the Moab Municipal Code Title 16 subdivisions to comply with land use authority designations and resulting in final Mylar plat signature authorizations, removing the City of Moab Planning Commission and City Council.
Okay, thank you, Miles. We have a motion. Is there a second?
I'll go ahead and second that.
All right, a second from Jill. Any further discussion for the motion that's on the table? All right, pretty straightforward. Whenever everyone is ready, all in favor of the motion, say aye. Aye.
Hi.
Aye.
Aye.
All right, motion passes 4-0. Thank you, everyone. All right, next is an action item 5.1, consideration and possible approval of planning resolution number 08-2025, a planning resolution approving the off-site parking agreement for the Expedition 88 restaurant on property located at 477 South Main Street, Moab, Utah 84532. This is a discussion and then a possible action. All right, thank you, staff, whenever you're ready.
Okay, so on this vicinity map up here to the north, we have 471 South Main, which is owned by Red Cliff Hotel LLC. And then down here, we have 481 South Main, which is owned by Moab Desert Plaza LLC, both of which are owned by Rob Radcliffe. And today we are establishing an eating establishment use on the parcel of Radcliffe Hotel LLC, and requesting 8 off-site parking spaces for the southern parcel there. So as you may remember, in 2023, Planning Commission approved a shared parking agreement for the Radcliffe Hotel with the same other parcel. That was a conditional approval, and then the team decided to pursue a lot line adjustment and parking lot redesign instead of following through with that shared parking agreement, and that is now moving through the DRT process. But in order to get this eating establishment use established as soon as possible, we've re-looked into the special parking exception idea. So all the materials were submitted on April 30th. And now we're ready for your guys' review. So the Expedition 88 restaurant is within the Radcliffe Hotel, and they'd like to change from an amenity use to a full service use. This enables them to advertise to a greater population than people that happen to be at the hotel. But this also triggers more parking spaces, 8, as the restaurant is 1,541 square feet, and eating establishments require 1 space for every 200 square feet. And today they are requesting that all 8 of those spaces be granted as a special exception by the way of off-site. So this is the approved site plan that has enough parking spaces for the hotel, retail, and amenity eating establishment uses. But now we're adding this use of eating establishment. These are the floor plans for the restaurant. The restaurant is situated right here, and then also down here. That makes up the square footage that you see on these floor plans. So our process today, Planning Commission, you guys approve special parking exceptions, including shared parking, payment in lieu, and offsite. So below here is the submittables that people need when they're trying for any of those special parking exceptions. In this case, number 1 doesn't apply, as this is not a shared parking agreement. This is an off-site parking agreement. There's no competition because they're not sharing with any other business. And number 3 also doesn't apply because this is not parking for hotel. This is parking for a restaurant. So the only submittables that they needed were a site plan and a written agreement between the 2 property owners, which is 1 man. Here is the site plan that they've provided. Perhaps, I'm not quite sure. But perhaps if anyone from their team is on, they could explain more about the yellow outline, but that is designated for another tenant. So the red outlined area is those 8 spaces that would be used for the restaurant.
Great. Thanks, Joanna. If the applicants are on and there's anything you'd like to add, you can certainly unmute and chime in. You're welcome to. You don't have to. But if there's anything else you'd like to cover, we'd be happy to hear it. Okay, I'm taking that as a no. Any questions from the commission for anyone on staff about the application? I personally am happy to see that there's more parking being provided, because when this hotel was first approved, I was on the planning commission and we have gave them a hard time about how they would invariably need more parking. So this makes sense, and I'm glad that it is actual parking. You know, it's not just parking in lieu, and it's parking that will actually be used for the business. It's not just something offsite to sort of check boxes. So it's a good use of the adjacent property for sure.
Definitely.
So to some degree, the only thing I'm curious about is the outline in yellow of this other tenant, that what he's using. If something goes in there that then requires parking, these 8 spaces are already theoretically reserved for the restaurant. So if they did a change of use there that required more parking than is on the rest of the lot, minus those 8 spaces, they would then have to account for that elsewhere with fee in lieu or some other. That's how this is working. Like, we're reserving those 8 spots and they don't get to be for both. They get to be for this restaurant if they want them for the restaurant.
Yeah, that is correct. The offsite parking agreement that will be recorded at the city will reserve these. We're hoping that it won't be a domino effect, because they are still in the process of redesigning their parking lot.
Yeah.
So hopefully that'll be done at some point.
Okay, that was my only curiosity, because I know that that's a large building and a large space that they plan on using, and I assume that whatever goes in there will definitely need parking. And I'm making sure we're not having a domino effect rolling that down the road. But provided that's being accounted for, far be it from me to tell one dude whether or not he can have somebody park on his other completely adjacent property. And I much prefer that than having somewhere else pick up the parking burden. So yeah.
Right.
No, I'll put that more plainly.
Makes sense to me.
That makes sense to me.
Okay, if there aren't any further questions, as usual, we can entertain a motion, and it looks.
I wanted to make one note before
Yes.
somebody makes a motion. On the resolution provided, there was one condition to approval. That was that the parking agreement is still in our attorney's hands.
Okay.
But then I also wanted to suggest adding another condition, that is that they actually need to record it.
Great.
Forgot that part.
Mhm.
That makes sense. I
And
think it's
wha-
short enough. Oh, Corey, go ahead.
Yes, well, and to compound that a little bit more, one suggestion with this is record with the county recorder, who will hold all of these types of agreements rather than the city recorder, who will help us process that. But the county recorder will actually be the one that files that recording.
Thanks, Corey. All right. We have a lovely recommended motion with a couple conditions. I think we can read the whole thing. Anyone? Carolyn, you want to give it up? She's unmuting.
Yeah, here I am.
All right. Yes.
I dare you to stop me, Miles. I'll move that the City of Moab Planning Commission conditionally approve Planning Resolution 08-2025, a planning resolution approving the offsite parking agreement request for the Expedition 88 restaurant on property located at 477 South Main Street in Moab, Utah, 84532, conditional on the following conditions. 1, city attorney review and approval of offsite parking agreement. And 2, offsite parking agreement is recorded with the county recorder.
Great. Thank you, Carolyn. We have a motion with those two conditions. Is there a second?
I'll happily second that.
All right, second from Miles. Any further discussion? Okay, motion on the table. All in favor, say aye.
I
All right, motion passes 4-0. Moving right along. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Johanna, for the information presentation. Let's see. Next on our agenda, we have item 5.2, consideration and possible approval of planning resolution number 09-2025, a resolution approving the Lost Springs condominium plat on property located at 238 South 400 East, Moab, Utah, 84532. This is a discussion and possible approval. Whenever you're ready again.
Thank you. Okay, we have a condominium platting exercise today for 238 South, 400 East, which is a property that is split zoned between the R3 and C5 zones. This is a 80 unit condominium development for platting. So in 2002, this project went through site plan approval. In April of this year, materials were submitted for the condominium plat. Those were taken to DRT review and comments were sent back to the applicant. And then in May, the applicant sent back materials that proved to be sufficient to all of the outstanding staff comments. This narrative is a holdover from the site plan, but it all remains true. This is a multifamily development with an office building that is taking over or replacing a mobile home park, and there are outdoor and then also some garage parking. Here we have the approved site plan, which shows our 3 buildings of dwellings and then the office building. And then I'll note on this slide that right here is where the zone split is, if we can all see that. On the left-hand side is the R3, and to the right-hand side is the C5. This is the draft plat for your approval this evening. So our process is, Planning Commission is the land use authority on this matter. It is reviewed to the standard of a subdivision, while also upholding the Utah Condominium Ownership Act. The development of this has already been permitted through this site plan. So tonight we are just establishing the condominium plat. And down here you can see what we've just recommended to change in our code, all those listing of signatures that hopefully we can amend. So another special thing about this platting is that it requires the active employment households to be noted on this plat. The 33% of units that need to be designated as active employment households only applies in the R3 zone. So just building 1 needs to have those set asides. And in building 1, there are 12 units. So that means there are 4 designated active employment households on this plat, and also recorded within the CCNRs that are also submitted. And then below there, you can see the portion of code that outlines the active employment households. And I believe that is it for my briefing.
Corey, are you able to give a little bit of background, excuse me, just a refresher on this project, just kind of where we've been, what initial project plans were, and then where we are now? I think that might be helpful.
Sure. Going back in time, when we were working through our active employment household ordinance, we had established our pending ordinance doctrine, which has a similar time frame to that of the legal mechanism of a moratorium, 180 days to establish an ordinance. The difference between a pending ordinance and a moratorium are generally the same, except for the thresholds or the bars for establishment are different. Moratorium being it can be retroactively applied, but it has to be constituting a more direct impact. I'll have some attorneys definitely critiquing my language here. A pending ordinance is really, and the reason there's a minutia here is the applications that through a pending ordinance that are filed following the establishment of that resolution for pending ordinance, meaning 180 days gives us time to get this ordinance into place, have to comply with that ordinance within the 180 days. That's relevant here in that this application came after the establishment of that pending ordinance doctrine. However, at the end of the 180 days, we failed to approve that ordinance. Therefore, that opened this project back up to vesting rights that preceded active employment household. Therefore, this project, given its time frame of approval, did not have to comply with the use parameter requirements established by AEH as a multi-household development of 80 units. However, as the project over these last couple of years has evolved in ownership and in style, the project ownership has elected to engage in a approval action that does open it up in that they're changing the entitlements of that project from a multi-household apartment project to a condominium. Therefore, the AEH now will have to apply as the use parameter elements of the particular underlying zone, just the R3. So that's the distinguishing effect between the R3 and the C5 zoning of the split zone of a single project of a single type of development. So that's where our particular application is only applying to building 1 in this case. Furthermore, to the style in which we are approving this is actually our first platting exercise of restricting AEH in this way of the use parameter option, meaning it's just a part of the underlying code. So the rough proportionality and the role of Planning Commission in this is to establish that the rough proportionality is satisfied. Now, of the 33%, they're proposing a strict number. So they're not proposing more or less than 33% of the units in that building one. Now it's Planning Commission's job to establish that they are indeed doing a roughly proportional division of those units. That means in square footage, size, type, those types of elements, which I think is established. We did see the draft plat in the presentation, but that was page 1. Page, I believe 2, and I think there might even be a third page, show the breakdown where the AEH is actually specifically designated on each of the units themselves, as well as a corresponding deed note on the plat. So we have a number of layers of information where the units themselves on the plat themselves is actually showing the designation, as well as the platting notes to designate how and what that description is referring to, and then we'll further be notified in a deed restriction for each of those units as they're platted specific to the deed title. So many layers. So this was an exercise from our attorney as well as us to establish how this is actually going to look for you guys as we go forward. So feel we've sufficiently satisfied what we'd need to show on the designation of these units, as well as your ability to review and confirm rough proportionality of that breakdown. So I think that's a bit of the overarching and the structure and how we're doing this. I'd be happy to answer any other specifics as we're moving forward with this, but I think Joanne's presentation kind of did hit the more narrative and background elements, but yeah, happy to address any other legal or clarifying pieces there.
Thanks, Corey. All right, discussion. What's everyone think about the item?
I mean, they seem to have satisfied what they need to satisfy to get this plotting approval. I now understand why the parking lot is positioned in the place that it is, but they're working within our requirements for our different zones, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely disappointed that the project isn't moving forward as apartments as
too.
originally
Yeah, I thought it
intended.
was
I know that was a
apartments. Remember, we were
huge
so excited.
discussion.
Yeah.
I remember being very excited on a Zoom call during COVID with the project applicant that this was going to be apartments centrally located in town.
Yeah.
And to house the people that were, to help house them that
And
were
help house the
displaced.
people that were displaced from the trailer court. But also it is their property. But I think it's great that the AEH requirements are in place for at least that portion of the property that is within the R3 zone. Obviously, that's a huge issue for us, is displacement of existing housing, not building anything and not providing for our local workforce. So I think that is an upside of this, and I'm glad that it applies, and I'm glad that it seems like the applicant is happily moving forward with that. Carolyn, any comments, thoughts?
I'm having a little bit of trouble looking at the proportionality from the square footage and kind of types of units perspective. I'm wondering if Corey or Johanna could direct me to, I'm looking at page 2 of the condominium map, but is that the right place to be looking, or is there somewhere better?
Corey or Johanna, if I need to, I can jump in on this. I've got the unit footages. Can y'all hear me all right?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
please
Would
do.
that
Cool.
be,
So I'm Cal. I'm the civil engineer for the project.
Hi,
I
Cal.
think the presentation by Joanna was great. Let me answer your question on designated AEH units. So unit 101 is designated AEH. It's a medium-sized, I'd say, unit. It's about 650 square feet. Also on the first floor is one of the smaller units, unit 105, which is about 400 square feet.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the upper floor, we've got unit 202 is designated, and it's one of the larger units, 1,000 square feet. And then we've also got another medium one, unit 206 at 650. So the breakdown is we've got one large, two medium, and one small.
Thank you. And then could you walk us through the remaining non-AEH designated units? Just like overview.
Yeah, so let's see. Our counts are, I think we've got two other large units. We've got one, two, three, four other medium units. And the remainder being small. So we basically took, instead of doing two small units, we did two mediums, although I think the actual balance would be if we did one large, one medium, and two small of the actual total unit counts.
That answer your
Thank
question?
you.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, I think I was getting confused by the garages.
Yeah, if you're looking
Mhm.
at the left one, all those other units in the middle are quote unquote units, those are garages. Yep.
And I think I will note from the staff side, the applicant team did provide that breakdown. So we do have that. I think I was waiting to see if we had it available for a pop-up to show and demonstrate that, but it was brought through the submittal process for that breakdown.
Yeah, I know I've got that breakdown somewhere myself too.
And apologize if this is outside of the scope. The AEH units, are those planned to be rentals, or would this be, excuse me, would you be retaining ownership, or would the developer, would the property owner be retaining ownership of those units, or planning to sell them as long as the buyers, or I guess the occupants, met the requirements of the AEH ordinance?
Yeah, I don't know what the intention of ownership is with these specific units, other than that they will make sure to meet the deed restriction on the AEH units. We went over that extensively in a meeting with Corey a couple weeks ago to make sure that they understood what needed to happen there. So as far as whether it'll be hold and rent or sell, I don't know the answer to that.
Great. Yeah, that's not part of our analysis right now, but always good to know. I think there's a lot of community interest, particularly because this is one of the first times we've just had a straight ordinance applicability for the AEH since we've passed that. So that's great. So that would be, obviously the difference. The AEH does allow, it's an occupancy standard, not an ownership standard. And so it could be owned by someone who does not fit the requirements, as long as the units are occupied, I think 9 months of the year, by someone who fits the requirements under the AEH ordinance. All right. Any other questions? What do we think about rough proportionality, folks? This really is the first time we've analyzed this in a potential plat under this ordinance.
On a less rough side, do we know what the total square footage, like livable square footage of the building that requires AEH, and then exactly how many square feet are being committed to AEH? Like, are we meeting
I think it's
33%?
33%, almost
yeah.
like dead on, right?
I mean, it
Corey?
looks like it. I didn't add it up
Yep.
in the calculator, but
Yeah, there I believe was a slight upward rounding. It was 3.95 something.
Mm.
So it did meet the satisfaction to increase it to 4, based on the square footage breakdown and number of units breakdown, excuse me.
Yeah, and the units breakdown.
Yeah.
Not square footage necessarily. That's the subjective part of it. It's,
Right.
you know, if you have 10 units, 3 of them need to be
yes.
AEH.
No, I was curious how close it came to like the letter of 33%,
Mhm.
and then what that actually had to round out to be, you know, units provided. And frankly, I appreciate the fact that they have made it a mix of units and
Mhm.
not just committed
all
a few
stable.
small units or something to AEH,
Mhm.
but it's something where multiple different people / families are going to be able to take advantage of that. And I think that's important as we move forward with AEH to set a standard like that.
Definitely.
Mhm.
And that was a big part of the discussion when that ordinance was being
Mhm.
drafted as well, was
Yeah.
how to, there's obviously a need across unit sizes in town,
Mhm.
but making sure that, especially for a smaller development, I think it makes sense to have it be a couple different things. A larger development, it might make sense to have 10 small units and then a few larger ones, but
Right.
I think for this does sort of fit the intent
Certainly.
of everything.
Mhm.
Yeah, and to some degree, it seems like the developers made an effort to make it fit that intent
Mhm.
well.
Mhm.
Any other questions or final comments? Cal, feel free to jump in again if there's anything else you feel like we should know.
No, I don't think so. If there are any other questions, happy to answer.
Great. Thanks so much for your time.
You bet.
I have a question for Corey, which is wondering if you could just give a quick overview of how the condominium platting process is different from a regular non-condominium platting process.
Sure. I'll try to keep it quite brief. Essentially, this is a platting exercise, which I've uh, more loosely and summarized as a ownership overlay. So how we're processing this is kind of in terms of a condominium conversion, which is a separate process than a condominium approval on its own. Given that we have an approved multi-household development that is converting or overlaying with that ownership aspect. However, it's not fully constructed. Therefore, a lot of the requirements for a full conversion, as you might see, like notification of tenants and certain procedures and processes they have to go, wouldn't necessarily apply. So what we're seeing here is if there were a project that came in and wanted to right off the bat apply for a condominium application, that is how they would go, and it would bundle that similar to how we might have seen a master plan development. Recently, we've been reviewing the Lions back, where you have a development review process as well as a platting process at the same time simultaneously. So all we're doing now is that development process or development review aspect has already been accomplished. So we're just filling in the gap of that platting exercise. How that's different than some of our other platting exercises, like a townhome. That's typically what is the most apples to a slightly different color apple we might get, is that a condominium process handled separate from a state perspective is paint to paint as far as ownership goes. So the HOA construction or the underlying plat or parcel, with the lots being a three-dimensional aspect in space, as opposed to a townhome where there is the unit and then also the land underneath it applied, is actually technically a subdivision of land ownership, even though it is still an ownership overlay. And this is all, of course, these two separate than what is a full subdivision process, which is where those pieces of land are subdivided really quite distinctly. And again, you might conceptualize this as layers of A true subdivision is platted, and that is its own individual lot with its own individual property rights, entirely separate. Townhomes, you do own technically a piece of land, but it's also within a collective common of ownership, or still this HOA aspect. Whereas condo, is it's a three-dimensional space where there is no land division. It's really just an overlay of ownership within a building or structure from paint to paint. So those are at least how I try to describe it, are the different platting exercises that we go through with different levels of essentially you have more regulatory requirements, but also more freedoms of private land use. So if you can see that sliding scale of how those exercises are different and the different implications of that. But I wasn't super articulate, but hopefully that fills in a little bit of the blanks.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Any other questions for staff? Things to discuss?
Not at all. I think it's good to see AEH working,
Yep, I'm excited.
and as far as approving the plating, the rest of it makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
These split zone things are
Mhm.
killing me,
I
but it's
do not
very common.
not envy property owners that have to deal with split zoning and development on split zoning. Because it seems like a lot, but yeah.
Alrighty. That said, our options this evening are to approve the recommended motion with or without modifications. We can continue the action if we need more information with direction to city staff, or deny the site plan application with specific findings for that decision.
I'll go ahead and move that the City of Moab Planning Commission approve the Lost Springs condominium plat on property located at 238 South, 400 East, Moab, Utah, 84532.
I'll go ahead and second that.
Okay, we have a motion to approve the Lost Springs condo plat from Miles and a second from Jill. Any other discussion? Any final questions before we vote? All right, all in favor of the motion on the table, say aye.
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 All right, motion passes 4-0. Thanks everyone, and thanks to Cal as well for joining us on the phone. Appreciate the information.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thanks. All right, next we're moving on to our discussion item for the evening. This is 6.1, a discussion on draft ordinance text amendments regarding EV readiness. This is a briefing and discussion, and Alexi Lam is now approaching the podium. We also have your ghost on Zoom.
Oh, yes. Share.
Your shadow self is on Zoom here.
Like a double Corey and ghost me. Okay. What I'm gonna do is go through kind of a recap of the stuff we've talked about so far. We've had a couple discussions, and then I'll pull up the proposed text and we can go through specifics on that. Okay, so here's a recap because you're probably tired of seeing the slides. In 2030 and 2040, those are the years that Moab has set as goals for 100% renewable energy and an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases. Transportation is about 29% of our current greenhouse gases. So if we can switch to electric vehicles, which we can't tell people to do, but we can give people the ability to do if they so choose. Electric vehicles in Utah right now are a lot more efficient than gas vehicles, which produce 172% more emissions than an EV. And for a lot of people, there are a lot of caveats to this about whether an EV is the right vehicle for the kind of driving somebody does. But in general, somewhere around 7 years is when the approximate total cost of ownership becomes lower for an EV as opposed to a gas vehicle. Okay, so currently, a little less than 1% of people who are driving cars and light trucks in Moab are driving electric or electric hybrid vehicles, something that requires a plug or can use one. And that's a small percentage, but more emissions could be realized. Reductions in emissions could be realized if more people were able to drive an electric vehicle. And most of that charging happens at home, about 80%. And a lot of people live in housing that they don't own and therefore have limited access to changing. And in particular, this affects people who are multi-household residences because sometimes the parking is separated from the actual building. And then the savings of installing EV-capable parking is much cheaper upfront when a building is initially being constructed because it avoids having to trench and do other things. About 85% savings for an outdoor type of parking situation to do it at the beginning as opposed to go back and retrofit. As a recap, the different types of EV charging preparation or readiness that's available is EV capable, which is the lowest level, where electrical capacity, conduit, and a branch circuit are available. If you add an actual outlet, it becomes EV ready. And if you add a charger to that outlet, then it's an EV installed. In this case, we have only proposed capable and ready spaces, nothing installed. It's not a recommendation against installed, just that it's not required. Okay. The basics about when it would apply. It would be to new multi-household dwellings with 3 or more units. These are the parking spots that are most likely to have separated access from a building. And then as we talked about, people who don't necessarily own their dwellings have limited ability to change what kinds of infrastructure is available to them. And it could also apply to modifications. In particular, I think the way it's written right now is 50% or more of a change to a non-exempt parking area. 10 parking spaces substantially modified, although there's some questions about whether that's appropriate or not. And we could include particular types of electrical upgrades that when you're upgrading your electrical, that you would include an electrical upgrade that would accommodate EV charging. The requirement as written right now, although this is just a proposal, is 10% EV capable, 10% EV ready, as we discussed in the last time, which is 20% total of required parking spaces or dwelling units. This allows for as well, if somebody wanted to install EV chargers, that it could count for their 10% in whatever number they want to install. And then if there are less than 10 parking spaces, just 1 EV ready spot. All right, how would this affect other parking requirements? It would count towards other parking requirements. It would not be additional parking to what is already required. It would be proportionate to ADA requirements. So if you're required to have that, then EV would have to be proportionate for ADA access for the EV charging spaces. And it doesn't affect spaces that would be used for 15 minutes or less. There's also a question in the draft about what time period that should be. Idea being you can't charge your EV in 15 minutes anyway. So it doesn't have to be something that would have a charger. And then what we did to try to manage costs. This was a concern in our conversations. It only affects multi-household dwellings because this is where people have least ability to affect how they can charge at home. 20% is the minimum recommended by experts, and we split it between the lower cost options, which are EV capable and EV ready parking. An exemption is proposed for projects that have onerous transformer upgrade costs. We can discuss that and what the level of that is, or if we want to include it at all. And there's also a proposed incentive to make it more affordable for 1 and 2 family households if they're already doing an electrical upgrade. So I'm going to switch now to the actual text. This is an electric vehicle, not a landscaping. You can tell that we're trying to use the same language to be consistent in code. Okay, so here we have the multi-household dwellings with 3 or more units. And if there are any questions about this or the definitions, I can answer those. We're gonna keep moving. And then this is the section where we get into the standards of 10% EV capable and EV ready for a total of 20%. And covering also that it applies to the minimum maximum allowed parking spaces. And the EV ready EV installed spaces would count towards the minimum. So you don't necessarily have to meet the letter of the 2020. Those are more minimums. If you want to go beyond that, you can. This is where we have the possible incentive for single and 2-family households. This would allow somebody who's already applying for an electrical permit to also upgrade their EV charging access at their house without paying additional review fees for having that included. So it would make it something that you could throw in if you wanted, if you're already having somebody review your electrical with the city. Are any thoughts about that particular incentive? We were trying to balance things that were feasible for the city to offer somebody that would help them get over that edge if they wanted to, without making an incentive that is too large for what we were offering. Or also we talked about to the level of that people were subsidizing something for like one person who wants an EV charger at their house. So any thoughts on that?
So how would that work? Sorry, I'm having trouble seeing the screen today.
Yeah, if you were submitting for an electrical permit, you wanted to make some sort of electrical modification to your house. Like the example in our last meeting was if you're putting electrical like in for your solar panels, and you also wanted to do something with your electrical vehicle charging on the property, that there would be no change from your permit fee perspective about including a review for the EV upgrade.
Whereas if you just did the EV upgrade by itself, there would be
Still be permit fees.
permit fees.
Yeah.
Seems pretty.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say, frankly, it seems like a nice gesture. I don't know if it would have the effect that we're looking for from an incentive wise, and I don't personally know like what it requires dollar for dollar from the city to have someone come out and do that inspection and then not receive permitting fees for it. And there are times where somebody would submit an electrical permit like to put in an connection for their hot tub or otherwise, that or their solar panels like you mentioned, where then they would want where they would benefit from this. But like permitting fees in general, I feel like once you've already bit the bullet on a permitting fee like this, like for a small modification like building permit, you're not seeing like impact fees or anything like that. So in general, permitting fees are not massive. So this doesn't feel like a significant incentive. And there's a part of me that like wanted the incentive to be enough that like the tenant of a rented property could make a case to their landlord that it was worthwhile to get this done. And I don't know that this quite hits that mark. But at the same time, I don't know essentially how much I can ask of the city or otherwise to provide. I would hope that there'd be, it's something that we could do to make that a little bit juicier. Like I think if somebody who's in a rental position who would really love to own an EV, but has an old home from the 70s that does not have that kind of power in the garage, and what it would take to kind of offset a cost like that. It's, like even if they had a crawl space to run the electricity through, you're talking at minimum several $100s in materials and time to get a branch ran out there. And that's if they didn't have to upgrade the panel and if they didn't have to, like all those things back just to get a 200, like to get a 40 or 50 amp outlet in the garage, you're talking, I don't know, a few $100s in materials and time, depending on how difficult your crawl space is. And I would hope that the incentive could help offset that a little bit more so that that tenant could make that case to their landlord that, hey, this could be really worthwhile because not only will other tenants be pleased by this, but so will I. That being said, yeah, it's only so much you can ask of the city to forgive. And I know the permit fees are useful and essential in keeping our building department running appropriately. So I'd hope that we could find a little bit more of a middle ground, but.
Hello, Commission. I might chime in on that if I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Go for
Okay.
it.
Just giving some perspective, ballparking, of course, and without the building official to make kind of more specific comment on what their scalable exercises might be, is that we would be looking likely in the realm of just south of $200 being waived for something like this, what we're talking about. So I think the balance, or at least the nuance that we were trying to approach just kind of as the initial offering, is a slidable scale from removing the idea of a disadvantage or disincentive of, well, not only am I trying to do the right thing, but I'm also having to pay for it. It's like, well, we can at least remove that piece. And then the sliding scale, of course, which is up to you guys, what you might like to propose to council, would be moving the sliding scale from a disincentive to trying to be neutral to even incentive. And this is where I think we've just reached into kind of this neutral territory of at least we're not disincentivizing this, trying to have it just be at least a pass through for this one aspect. But certainly the idea of edging up towards incentivizing, those are options. But again, there is nothing that is free. It will have to come from somewhere, whether that's the citizens as in a form of taxpayer or reductions in capacity with our building official or building department or plan reviews, whatever that might be. There is no free lunch, unfortunately. So our understanding in the incentive world, it will be, where does that threshold become valuable in proportionality to what it is that's happening into the community? So I think if we're using that in that realm of sliding scale of incentibility, I think we could certainly move up or down in that. And I think what I'm hearing is the idea of, can we push it a little bit further? And I think the idea is, of course, yes, but keeping that in mind of how that sliding scale can continue to increase. Hopefully that makes sense, and just a bit of contribution to Miles, your input of a couple $100 or plus. Well, this is at least taking at least the backside of that, where you're maybe the doubling of that cost could be at least the single cost of installation without the doubling of it just from permitting and process.
Certainly. I think if anything, if we're talking about like permitting fees could be about $200 or, about $200 for something like this. And, installation could be, I don't know, double that in materials and double that in time. That isn't, you kind of hit the line of, it's not a massive incentive, but it definitely makes it a less difficult process. Part of me just wonders too, if maintaining this kind of idea of not making it a large incentive, because of course we don't want to pull funds from elsewhere. But this is all tied to already doing electrical work on your property. And part of me wonders if a small concession could be made if you were choosing to just do this. If you were like, if you as the landlord were like, okay, I will do my best to get you an outlet in the garage you can charge your vehicle from, even if it was a flat reduction. So, if it's a building permit simply for an application of building permit simply for the installation of an EV capable outlet in the garage, that there would be a flat, I don't know, $150 that they would take out of the required, permit fees or something like that. And of course, that's just a super round number and whatever seems most appropriate at the end of the day. But that, because, well, of course, we also will happily incentivize people who are already doing electrical work. I feel like what hit me the most about all this in general was just that how many people are already going to be doing that. And what we're really trying to incentivize in the single family world is getting somebody who's renting a house to some tenants to be willing to do this for them.
Yeah, I had the same thought as Miles, where I think this is great how Corey talked about the spectrum from, disincentivizing to incentivizing to being kind of neutral. But curious, Alexi, what thoughts you have to share about the idea of just waiving the permit fees for EV charger installation work in general. So like Miles said, it wouldn't have to be coupled with, another application for electrical specific permit, but could really just be this kind of low hanging fruit at any time that would be maybe helping to get more landlords and homeowners honestly through the door in terms of wanting to move ahead with charger installation or even EV readiness work.
Yeah, I think Corey covered a lot of what we had discussed prior to this, was just that our building department has limited capacity with some changing state level rules about approvals. A lot of things are trying to be reviewed on a faster timeline, and it's difficult to be able to do permit reviews for free. But it is something that we can take back to the community development office and see if we can come up with any other ideas for how to tip it into something that's a little more favorable, especially for people who aren't already doing an electrical upgrade. Corey, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Other than I think that is an option for us. I think the way we've said it was kind of the most neutral, but at this idea of because again, that was some of this workload was being folded into the workload already. That was kind of the idea of it. It was really just truly bare bones neutral to remove the disincentivizing elements. So this idea of coming in for a permit that is probably the very next level of just stepping into an incentive level, just barely in that threshold. That the scope, like I said, something like this, just south of $200, and considering how many permits we may be going through, also capacities of how that permit fee is actually broken down between a plan review, permit and processing fees. It's not just one line item on that invoice, if you will. There are numbers of where those funds are going. If it's all happening in-house, and so our building officials are doing the plan review fees and the inspections and the permit fee processing, that could be something we could, for lack of a better term, we could eat those expenses without too much offset given the scope of what we're talking about. So I don't think that's something that, I mean, again, it's budget revenue balancing that we're going to have to do, but it's something that I think, given this is a priority of ours, and if that can move that needle that much further, I don't think that next step would be that great for us to absorb. So I think we'll certainly, I think, like Alexi said, bring it back to the community development office, speak specifically to the building office of how we can absorb that within our budgets and revenues. But I think it can be done certainly to that level. I think as we start paying you in a rebate system, okay, now we're talking in a little bit different scale, of course. But I think this is digestible.
Part of me also wonders, like, what if you just made it a really approachable flat rate? Like, permit fees vary, and I know that for like a single homeowner applying for an owner builder permit, there's a lot of questions as to like, how much is this really going to cost me, and how is this process really going to go down? And if it was like a very straightforward, like, you pay you $75 and you submit these documents and we give you an approval to put this in, to install an EV ready outlet in your garage. And if somebody wanted something greater than that or different than that, like if you kind of made a cookie cutter application that somebody could fill out that would be easy, they would give them a very straightforward idea of what they needed to provide and what they needed to do to have this EV ready installation happen. And it had like a flat rate, so we're not completely eating that cost you know, as Corey's saying, but it's still an incentive. And frankly, kind of, if it was a cookie cutter proposal, hopefully the review end of things on the staff side would be easier. And then on the homeowner side, putting all that together would be easier, and it would kind of like just be a little bit smoother on both ends, cost a little bit less of the staff's time, but also maybe, you know, be a bit more of like an expected expense and process for the homeowner. So it doesn't feel like, oh, what am I getting into? It's like, oh, I'm getting into this and it's going to cost me that.
Yeah.
I would agree. And so I'll retract my earlier statement about the waiver kind of maybe being the next step, is that I think Miles has identified maybe a half step, which is partial fee, which we actually did exercise that within our AEH system, where we were able to waive our permit fee processing elements. That's our in-house revenue piece. But plan review, which in some scales is actually an outsourced process where we're actually just passing through costs, as we had to at least cover our costs and what we're passing on to third party. So that could be something similar. Oh, even though it's very much probably all in-house, we could break that down. So maybe as a half step or negotiation with the building department of what's the bare minimum we need to kind of stay at a zero expense cost, maybe not in the black of revenue, because we really never are. We're always in the red to some degree. But at least cover those bare minimum of some of our servicing charges that are essential, but remove some of those that are maybe less essential. So that is a half step. I'd still think we'd try to negotiate for a waiver as kind of that next biggest step to get into that incentive role realm versus a partial incentive. But having that in the toolkit of options, I think, is a great idea.
Yeah, we'll talk to building department, talk in community development, and see on what options we might have on that scale. Thank you.
I also wanted to mention that there's been a lot of conversations at the Affordable Housing Task Force over the last year plus about trying to institute some sort of good landlord program. And this feels like the kind of thing that would fall kind of squarely in that realm, where you're, you know, trying to incentivize landlords to do different things beyond code compliance to provide, you know, safe, affordable, comfortable, high quality housing for renters in our community. And there will obviously be conversations about how to fund different components that are a little bit more carrot oriented, associated with different things that might fall under a good landlord program. But this seems like something that we should definitely keep in mind as that program is getting scoped out.
Great, thank you. All right, I'll keep going. That's good feedback. After this, we get into ADA. If you have questions about a couple of these, like safety, maintenance, things like that, we can stop. Otherwise, I think we'll just try to figure out the most efficient way to code for basic proportionate ADA and EV parking. So the comment on this about, is there a more efficient way to make that reference, is that it's very similar to other ADA requirements and just trying to make the code streamlined. Same with fire and safety. Maintenance, this is making a requirement that they are maintained and functioning. Right now, even the city would be in violation of this. The city's EV charger is not fully functional right now. Half of it is not functioning. So there may need to be some additional work to this one because we don't have it written with any kind of process for how this would be managed. Okay. Getting down to the capacity requirements, one of the questions is currently we have the equipment must terminate within 3 feet of an EV capable space. I believe Phoenix, there's a note farther down, has it at 6 feet. It's a minor change. If anybody has an opinion on that, I'd like to hear it. Okay. All right, and then getting down to EV equipment that is installed. This is where we included some information about load management and how to handle that. This was based off of the article that Carolyn had sent prior to the prior meeting. The one we had, I think it was in March, to talk about this. So load management right now, it's only written that it would benefit somebody who was installing EVSE. It wouldn't apply to EV capable or EV ready, but for somebody who was installing EVSE, it would let them have a lower capacity that would be split among the chargers that are available. Any thoughts on that one?
Sorry,
No,
Alexi, going back up a little bit. I mean, there's a couple of references to the
Sure.
3 feet, which you asked us about, but have you seen any sort of like cost projections of the difference between establishing the 3 feet versus the 6 feet that you mentioned that Phoenix has? Like, is that a significant difference in terms of upfront installation cost, or how are people deciding on whether to go 3 feet or 6 feet in other communities?
Yeah, I haven't seen cost estimates on it, and even the ones about EV spaces and the differences between retrofits and new are pretty specific to different locations. So there are some numbers out there on this, but I haven't seen anything this specific about the benefits. In some ways, it seems like a relatively easy thing to do that could reduce costs for somebody from my perspective, but I don't have actual numbers.
frankly, I can't imagine the difference between like an extra 6 feet of conduit, 3 on either side, being massively cost prohibitive. Like a little bit of extra digging, a little bit of extra conduit. If you're already laying a bunch of conduit, that does not seem like a hugely cost prohibitive moment.
Yeah, it seems like it would mostly affect people who are retrofitting,
Yeah.
because then they might be doing some trenching and other things, which would get more expensive. But I think for a new one, probably minimal. For something that's a retrofit, it might have some impact.
I know Miles is someone who retrofits people's houses with things. What do you think?
I mean, in that example,
Giving yourself more work is really bad.
well, and I don't even I don't do electrics. But that being said, like the problem with retrofits is they are so property specific.
Yeah.
But with that being said, terminations within 3 feet or 6 feet, I mean, you still have to then run the wire through some amount of conduit to get to the panel or to get to the outlet. And so, yes, it could be a little bit more trenching. I feel like possibly that would be a place to reach out for some community feedback. I hire an electrician to do our electrics. I don't know that specifically, so I wonder if somebody, in the community would weigh in that way. But I mean, even for a retrofit, to me, it feels like, again, 6 feet on either end of where the conduit has to run. For the most part, you're going to run it directly to the panel and directly to the outlet anyways. So
Okay. Any other discussion on that one? We'll see what we can find. Okay, and any other things on load management or anything about the capacity requirements?
I mean, in regard to load management devices and stuff like that, like provided they're code compliant and safe and all that kind of thing, which I'm assuming they are, they seem honestly like a good idea, because not like all of the charging stations are going to be pulling full amperage at all times. And especially when it comes to like charging vehicles overnight, which is where I think a lot of this is centered, the idea of load management makes a lot of sense, because even if 3 vehicles are very low on battery and wanting to pull a full charge at the same time, and load management has to even that out, if you're leaving it there all night, it'll still get charged.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be very cost prohibitive to upgrade panels and transformers and all that for for significantly more load. So this seems to defer some of that cost for some of the newer developments, and I think that's worthwhile.
I'll point out to one other thing that is in the installed section, which is if you want to install something that's a fast charger. then it counts up to 5 level 2s. I don't expect a lot of places would be installing fast chargers at, let's say, a triplex, but it would let multiple people charge. It would be less convenient for overnight parking. Are there any opinions on that one?
No, I think you're right that a lot of people won't go to the expense of those fast chargers. And that's fine. But
Particularly residential.
Mhm.
yeah,
It's not.
yeah.
Not like
for commercial,
park in
that
front of
makes
my
sense.
business and buy things and also charge your car. It's, I'm going to bed, I'm gonna plug my car in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it would be a popular one, but I also, if somebody for some reason wanted to do it, I didn't want to say, well, it counts as exactly 1 level 2, which didn't seem quite right either.
Part of me does wonder on the practicality of that though, because if you have a fast charger in like an apartment building, then if somebody parks in front of it, leaves their car for the night plugged into the fast charger, then the charger itself is not as useful and available to the other tenants of the property unless you were going to play like musical cars with that parking space. And that seems like a lot. So part of me wonders, like, to count one of those as 5 of the level 2s, like, may not be as functional. Yeah, they serve different purposes, may not be as functional from an apartment building perspective. Like for a hotel, okay, fine, that still seems to make sense because somebody may stop in and just charge their vehicle for a short period of time or otherwise, because it is more of a commercial thing. But if it's genuinely just there are 5 people in the apartment complex that need to plug in their EV and they're all sharing one fast charger, that doesn't seem as practical as having 5 level 2 chargers.
Yeah. Carolyn, do you have any thoughts on that or insight from a sustainability perspective or?
No, I generally agree with Miles's comments. Did you see any examples, Alexi, in some of the other and just some of the materials that you've reviewed that kind of made a strong case for why this is an advantage to include in an EV readiness ordinance?
I think so it is included in some other cities' code. The specific case of multi-household parking is a little different than just a general EV readiness sort of code, which is probably why we're having this discussion. What installing a fast charger does is it turns that parking space into more of a fuel station as opposed to an overnight parking space. And it probably would be something that had to be negotiated among neighbors. It could also be considered an amenity if you liked having that ability, but it could also annoy some people who would rather just plug in overnight and not have to, 30 minutes later go out and move their car. So I think from my perspective, it's just allowing one other variation on this. And I am not particularly sure of what situation somebody would want to do this, but that happens all the time, that somebody will come through and they'll be like, I have a grant for fast charging or something, just one-off situations. So this would allow our code to accommodate that as an incentive or a reduction in total EV parking that's required. But it isn't an incentive we have to offer, or not even an incentive, but just like an option. It doesn't have to be an option that we make available to people if we think that it's overall not beneficial to people charging.
Part of me also thinks just, oh, go ahead, Carolyn.
It's interesting that you said you think it's not uncommon for grants that are specific to fast chargers come through and could affect how deployment of this infrastructure is rolled out. Like, I think that makes maybe a little bit of a better case for keeping it included just as an option, but I wonder about decreasing the ratio so it's more like replaces up to 3 level 2 chargers instead of 5 or something like that. Or it would probably be too complicated, but I was thinking about how the situation that this seems to make the most sense for a multi-household, multi-family dwelling is for ones that also have that kind of like mini park or clubhouse or public space that people might be like rotating out of a bit quicker than in the overnight charging situation. But that's really getting into some details at probably a overly granular level.
Yeah, I think of it maybe as being more of a contingency that somebody has a situation like a clubhouse or a grant or a something where this makes sense as opposed to something that we think is a common occurrence. Would the commission like to change that to 3 from 5?
I'm just gonna say, yeah, 1 for 2, but 1 for 3 makes some sense as well. Plus, part of me, and this may be part of my ignorance with EV charging, but if you put an EV charger on the margin between 2 parking spaces, and it was like a fast charger, right? That somebody could pull up, charge, and their charge could be completed, and then it could be moved to the next vehicle without either vehicle having to actually physically move. So 1 for 2 at the very least could be.
Yeah, I think the only issue with that is then you just have to sort of reserve both of those spaces
Yeah.
for EV charging, because it doesn't, obviously, if someone parks their
Yes, somebody else parks in there.
normal gas vehicle.
But yeah, theoretically, you could put 1 charger in between the
Yeah.
2, and then, but like if that was
You could put it in a block of 4 in a carport. area
Exactly, and
where it can
to
reach
some
4
degree,
different
though,
spots.
if that was a slow charger in the block of 4, it'd be far less useful because the time it would take for each vehicle to charge. But if it was a fast charger, then the only thing is, like, I guess you'd have to be cool with your neighbor unplugging your car when it's done. I don't
I have no idea.
I
how that
don't
works.
EV, so that
Yeah.
that the logistics the logistics of that escape me. But with that being said, part of me wonders if there could be some thought put to that by someone who actually drives an EV and charges it and understands how to tell when. Yeah,
EV etiquette. Yeah, it definitely exists.
yeah,
EV etiquette, I'm sure it does.
yeah. It's like you shouldn't unplug your neighbor's car, even
It's
if
like laundromat etiquette.
Yeah,
You take people's
exactly.
clothes out of the dryer and
Mhm.
put them somewhere.
yeah,
Yeah.
certainly.
Yeah, it's sort of like that.
Unless they leave it in there too long, then you
This
can
is
put it
my
in one of those
version
like
version
this.
of that.
But yeah,
Yeah, I mean, if I think the real question is like, do we want to get too much into the weeds with what we're putting in our ordinance? Because I think we certainly could say, it's equivalent of 4 if it's accessible by 4 spots.
Right.
Or something like that, which I think makes sense, but do we want to drill down that?
part of me
that
says
narrow?
1 for 3 also
Yeah.
is a pretty round number, and if it becomes massively problematic, it could be approached again
So
by.
it seems like 5 might approach a little much for everyone, but
Sure.
yeah.
And again, going back to what Alexi said, like, it's not super likely that somebody's going to choose to do this, but if they have specific grant money or some real specific reason they want to do it, like, I think offering them some amount of incentive, but 1 for 5 might be a bit much, sounds pretty reasonable.
Okay, great. Thank you for the feedback. We are nearing the end. Okay, things are legally non-conforming until, so we have 50% or more of a change to a non-exempt parking area. So unlike something like the building code, which goes into effect at a building permit, this would be more specific to the type of work that you were doing, to parking. The 10 spots, I think, is up for discussion because we don't actually know which 10 spots they would be substantially modifying or where they are located. So that could make connections to electrical very difficult if it's at the back end of your parking lot. And then the other thing that we could consider is whether doing electrical upgrades would then trip doing electrical upgrades that would accommodate the EV access, even if you didn't have the chargers yet. In the future, if you changed your paved area, that you could have the electrical ready for that. Thoughts about when this should go into effect?
It's so hard. It's still so hard for me to wrap my mind around requiring somebody to do something else on top of doing electrical work, because that's already such a high bar.
Yeah, well,
In Moab, where there's like
Mm.
2 electricians, that maybe you can
Right.
get somebody 8 months from now, maybe.
Right. Mhm.
well, and part of the other thing that gets me is like, okay, if you're doing parking lot maintenance because it's necessary, because you've had potholes or problems, and like, it's one thing to do it for new construction when you essentially already have the money together, but I'm just trying to think in the perspective of like a business owner who's like, man, I'd really love to fix those potholes in my parking lot. But if I start to work on it, then I'm also going to have to trench and install EV. And I would, which would add a lot of money. And I would love to not put a barrier forth for people doing like parking lot maintenance, because quite frankly, like, that's expensive in the first place.
Mhm.
On the other hand, the electrical maintenance makes a little bit more sense to me, because it's like, if you're gonna do a new panel, then why not at least make space in the panel for, for an EV ready, like, not that you would have to run the conduit, but just that if you're gonna do the panel itself, then why not at least leave space in the panel for a few breakers to service an EV ready, or, like, just to service an eventual EV installation. To me, that seems a little bit more reasonable, because I mean, the idea of like having to buy a panel that's 50 amps or whatever larger than the one you were planning because you have to meet this requirement seems less burdensome than like, hey, I want to fix the potholes in the back 10 spaces I have, and that means I have to trench a massive thing through my parking lot to be EV ready.
Yeah, I think it is helpful to remember that we're only talking about multifamily buildings here too. In terms of like, adding undue burden of cost when trying to make improvements. I'm not sure exactly well, I assume that I don't think that our code really has strong requirements. Maybe I'm wrong. Let me back up here. So we're saying we don't want to disincentivize landlords from maintaining, drivable parking lots by creating an added hurdle for addressing those issues that would be incurring more costs by making parking lots EV ready. But I don't think we currently don't really have a very strong compliance pathways for ensuring that landlords are staying up on their parking lots in the first place, to my knowledge. So I don't know. To me, it doesn't seem like it would be adding a huge amount of additional burden. And I think the more opportunities that we pass up to encourage proactive infrastructure installation is not only, ultimately saving landlords money in the long run, but also saving tenants money in the long run, and helping to make sure that that sort of the opportunities to take advantage of EV charging are growing across our community in terms of rental properties, with the sort of proportion that we anticipate EV adoption happening at. I don't think that I articulated that super well, but to me, I definitely agree that the bare minimum should be, if a panel upgrade is happening, it should be EV ready. But I don't have a huge problem with also adding that sort of trigger when there's a significant parking lot or parking space project happening.
I think all in the interest of anytime someone doesn't have to go back and sledgehammer or jackhammer something.
I think
Is a good time to maybe trigger a little nudge.
to some degree, I agree, at least in my head, and maybe to put it in perspective for some of the others, is when I think of like a panel upgrade and having to add another 50 or 100 amps or something to it, I think in the few $100s, maybe a few $1,000s, depending on just how much you had to add to be EV ready. When I think of cutting up pavement and installing conduit underneath it and then repairing the pavement, I start thinking in tens of thousands of dollars quickly. Some of the, even if it's just for 5, 10, 15 feet of that kind of work can be 50, 60, $70,000. So to me, it's like if the parking lot, if you're doing 100% of the parking lot and you're tearing, you're tearing out all that asphalt anyways, the cost of trenching, the couple $1,000s it would cost to, run a 20-foot trench through your parking lot, minimal compared to what you're doing already. But if you're just kind of like doing patchwork, like part of me feels like that's not defined well enough in regards to like what parking space improvement or otherwise is. Cause like if you're just pouring a top coat or doing patchwork and then repainting lines, like then asking to cut a trench and do that seems very expensive, seems a big ask. So I'm, more than, Corey's frozen, but his hand's up.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me all right? Am I frozen or am I moving?
Oh,
Yeah,
you're
I'm
Hear you.
Oh,
You're
okay.
good.
Thank you. That was actually a great segue into some of the language elements that we're seeing here. I think, which is, I think the job of this commission is to establish some of those thresholds and staff to respond to those. But did want to point out, I think where Miles is going with this is the specific language we're seeing here is spaces substantially modified. That's a qualifiable versus quantifiable element, which isn't necessarily bad in that I think within this provision, and I think to Carolyn's point, without becoming hyper granular, which will always have, the way our building department puts it, dividing mercury, we're just creating more surface area for thresholds of conflict to arise of where those thresholds exist, is that we're basically installing an interpretive element of substantially modified, which is quantifiable by definition or won't be quantifiable by definition. But the saving element of that I see is that we have an exceptions process. So I think if the zoning administrator determines this is indeed a substantial modification, the applicant has two additional options. One is to go to the planning commission through a set of criteria, establish why it is not a substantial modification or why within their particular context it would not make sense to modify. And then thirdly, an appeal, going through appeal procedures, which I don't think that'd be an optimal, because they'd be objecting to those the criteria itself at that point, which I think we would be satisfying the objective criteria. But I think what I'm getting at is we're not going to be able to accommodate for any particular situation. And even if we started going down that road of saying, well, if you have this much pothole surface area that we're filling in, we'll never get to a fine point where we're going to handle any particular specificity. That keeping the zoning administrator, who hopefully will be a positive actor for both an advocate of the code and then the purpose of interpretation, as well as the applicant or owner themselves, of what is the intent of this code. But I think that's the idea of zoning, is if we feel strongly enough that we want to install this into our code, we can't, I think, open the door too wide for people just to continue to band-aid through generations where it will never be updated, because they will continue to, in micro elements, band-aid through situations where it probably should have been modified long ago. I think to your point, anytime you're taking a jackhammer to it, or even a substantial modification, 10 spaces, that's a, like you said, Miles, already a substantial amount of work, where what we're actually installing underneath that maybe not that much. So potholing, to me, as a zoning administrator type interpretation, would be maybe that's not the case. Maybe I don't think that qualifies. And then somebody could also, appeal that type of determination later. In fact, I hope that makes sense. Is that I think that's why Alexi and I really wanted to profile, or at least my suggestion was, keep a lot of our structural mechanisms that we have created within landscaping, for example, for this exceptions process. Is it's working. Yes, you have a lot of people coming to planning commission, but we're getting good products coming out of it, that I think are custom products, that nobody's getting ruled out just by a lack of language. So I hope that makes sense. I also appreciate the Plan Commission's navigation of where those thresholds are. I think our job is to make the language structure work. So I think where you set thresholds, we'll make the language structure work following that. But I think the conversation's correct, but confirming, I think we're setting ourselves up well.
So Corey, you're advocating for retaining the language substantially as opposed to like trying to lay out more specifically in the ordinance itself, like what we're thinking of these different trigger thresholds as being.
In this case, I am. I think in scenarios where it's maybe more finite, there are a certain few number of definable elements. I would probably move us to define the code better. In this case, I can imagine it being far too broad in a practical application for us to cover everything, where by trying to cover some, we are going to very likely exclude a great number of things that should have been implied. So I'm comfortable with this language, even though it does leave a lot more towards the burden of interpretation. But I think that's what we're signing ourselves up for with a lot of these more aggressive initiatives and ordinances towards these types of sustainability elements.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I don't know how our resident lawyer feels about the language proposal there, but makes sense to me.
Yep, that'll be, and that's I think our next threshold review is we'll certainly get some commentary on those for sure. But yeah, again, I think we're setting this, using some consistent language metrics, 50% change. That's consistent with our landscaping ordinance. Because again, we're trying to balance within what could be described as an arbitrary realm of when does it become an impetus enough to change. I think 50% is clearly effective. I think 10% of the, or excuse me, 10 parking spaces substantially modified. Well, that's when essentially you're redoing the 10. Well, that's the minimum threshold to get kicked into this ordinance. So I think both of these do make sense to me. But I think the commission's discussion on these thresholds is being very responsible for how it could be applied and implications to our owners and business owners for sure. I guess we don't want to disincentivize to the point of deferred maintenance or lack of maintenance at all. But I think at the point of if it's bad enough that you're having to rip up 10 spaces or 50% of your parking lot, you're already there. So I think Miles' example of, not fixing a few potholes, well, I don't know if that substantially qualifies because really that's that's a maintenance issue, not a reestablishment metric in my limited capacity of understanding that.
Well, to some degree, that almost answers my question in a round way. It's like, I feel like while I completely understand what you're getting at in regards to making this lead towards more review and getting more tailored options for people themselves, maybe a little bit more definition to what would be considered substantial would help potential property owners just know what they're getting into as they go forward. Because of course, while exceptions and bringing these kind of things in front of us or these further review processes do help us get these tailored solutions, they also are time consuming and ask a lot of the applicants who come forward for these exceptions. So making sure that they kind of know what they're in for when they go to maintain their parking lot or go to amend their parking lot, at least gives everybody an idea of, what they're up against. And I think would help with that because to some degree, I just feel like if I were a business owner that had a parking lot, I would want to know at what threshold I would hit substantial.
And I think that's a fear of the open-endedness is what if we don't have a good actor as a zoning administrator and they're far too onerous with that is I think what we could do, and we've done this other places in our code that balances this is a substantially modified including but not limited to stream of examples. That leaves us some interpretive authority, but definitely sets parameters around a reasonably debatable group of improvements. So, for example, including but not limited to removal of your top 4 over your 6. The bottom 6 inches of road base, well, that's very manageable. But the minute you're removing the top 4 of your hard asphalt, yeah, that's substantial. Those types of rolling elements, we could probably collect a few examples that set some boundaries of that. Then it does become a really defensible position for a property owner that's being or feels is being misinterpreted or too onerous of a requirement to say, look, these are the costs for the things that you've included. Here's my cost of what you're asking me to do. Something that they could either bring to planning commission or to an appeal authority saying that we're out of order. But I think that's a great suggestion. I maybe not in a definition section, which is where my first thought was, but maybe in a including but not limited to stream subsection of that substantially modified.
I quite like that.
Yeah, same here.
Okay, that's what we'll do. And then include electrical is what I was hearing.
Yes.
Okay.
You have a major electrical upgrade, panel or otherwise.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem like a huge leap there.
We'll work on both of, yeah. Like I will and we will, because I know the planning division and building will also be involved. Okay, moving on. 15 minutes for exemptions. The number is not specific. I have seen this for short term, but that felt too open-ended. So I put a time on it, but 15, 30, 35. It's all a little arbitrary, and I don't even know how closely this would necessarily be enforced on would anybody get kicked out of that space? But it's mostly just a way to, if you have a pickup spot or the side of the grocery store where people are getting their groceries, things like that. It's, they're going to wait there for 5-10 minutes until everything's loaded up and they're going to drive off, that those are not included. So are there any thoughts on the time or the language here? Specific, not specific?
I think 15 makes sense.
I
Frankly,
think
it
so.
just incentivizes more businesses to put up 15-minute parking only signs, and I'm on board with that because I feel like there's like significant need for that.
Carolyn, go ahead.
Isn't this specific to multifamily buildings though, this ordinance?
It does, but sometimes, like as you pointed out, like with places that have a central location, there could be like a loading zone or other things where people are using for moving or for picking people up. So it probably, there's not a lot of this at most multi-household, but the idea was just to just say that it doesn't count in case you have it.
An additional contribution from a text Title 17 update perspective on this is we are going to be evaluating our parking requirements kind of across the board as far as more sophisticated. But right now, that would be a debate whether 15-minute parking spaces would qualify as your parking required spaces at all. So there's some, if we had 20 spaces required for some multi-house development, they select 3 of those 20 to be 15-minute, they're exempt from this provision, but are they exempt? Is that really a reduction in parking kind of after the fact? We've dealt with this in the past. Some questions about oversized parking counting as 2 or small vehicle parking. I can't remember some of the terms for those, but people say, well, can I add
Compact.
Compact. Thank you. Thank you. Compact parking.
The entire Walker parking lot, basically.
Right. Well, and we see how successful or not successful that is. So I think there's some sophistication we'll have to deal with when we're doing the upgrade. So to the parking requirements, that is. So I think this is maybe teeing us up within our own code for maybe a little bit of debatable territory of how we're able to regulate or enforce some of our regulatory code for parking. So I want to be careful of this. Maybe I'll take a closer look with Lexi and our attorney of how do we want to treat this, because I think this is a good idea. We should not be requiring this calculation variable into our what would be required parking spaces. So this is, for me, the way I'm viewing this is if you elect to add additional 15-minute parking spaces, these will not be included. So maybe there's some language in there of you meet your minimum parking requirement, and then you can have additional compact or these 15-minute parking spaces, but you wouldn't necessarily have this static requirement applying anyway. So I think the thought process is good. I think I'm going to have to do a little homework on supporting the rest of the code to allow room for this, I think is where I'm coming from. So
Cool.
more of a comment than a question, I think.
Okay, we'll talk more about how to make it fit with the rest of the code. And the next one on the exemptions is meant to be a cost saving measure for people who are encountering an expensive transformer upgrade. The idea is that EV readiness should not be killing your project. So Corey and I had some discussions about this. The actual level is again kind of arbitrary, 5%, 2%, 7%. And it's just applying to the transformer cost, not to the total upgrade cost. But the idea would be that one of the barriers we discussed was that some people in some neighborhoods could be running into kind of they were the person who tipped the neighborhood to the next size transformer. And if that was too expensive compared to the total cost of the project, that they would not have to do this.
Interesting.
This is not something we have to offer. It's not even common in the codes that I was looking at, but it was a way to try to limit this from becoming something. Another way to do that would be the exception process, as opposed to having a written in code.
Part of me likes the spirit of this, but thinks that this kind of thing would be most appropriate for the exceptions. Because it's not something that a lot of people are going to deal with, but in the rare case that somebody is the one that tips their neighborhood to the next, transformer level and are being saddled with that cost, that would be the point for them to come in front of a panel and have that discussion. Also, because I have no clue if 5% is appropriate or 2% or 7%. Like,
Yeah, I was going to say, Alexi, in the version that was linked in our agenda packet, I can see the comments that you left.
Mhm.
And I feel like the comment gives helpful context about that 5% threshold. Oh yeah, there it is.
Yeah, right. That we were trying to bring it in under other safety measures that were more essential, like floodplain or ADA types of improvements.
Would there be significantly more? I feel like there would already have to be a little bit of back and forth between um planning or development review to sort of like prove that the 5% threshold has been met to grant this exception versus the actual process of um like pursuing an exception through planning commission. But I don't know, like Corey and Alexi, do you have any comments about those kind of like two pathways and their varying levels of burdensomeness on city staff and applicants?
From my perspective, probably having it like this, where if they can show us the total cost of the project and the 5%, then it's easier, because usually we help people through putting their paperwork together for special exceptions. And then for the applicants, they have to wait sometimes weeks to get those special exceptions. So I think for them, it is nice to have it. However, to the point that Miles made, is this the right level? I think that there's definitely ambiguity there. Corey, what do you think?
Uh, Great conversations. I think where we've most explicitly dealt with this, or at least within the planning office, is within the floodplain. What I've typically seen is those project costs can be to a certain degree adjusted in favorable consideration because, again, they're project estimates. I think certainly with Rocky Mountain Power, the transformer will be quite clear, but how that proportions out to the overall project, where I think it's been most clear and successful is the 20% of ADA, because it's a little more direct. But those are same tools, slightly different measurements of how we get there. So I could see this process that if we moved this to an exceptions realm and we were seeing it in a way, again, kind of using the landscape ordinance as a kind of a precedence of process and how we work through that is we've seen a number of those that have come through that we said this is consistent enough. Maybe we should be making this administrative. The commission has seen enough of them and ruled in the same consistent way enough. We feel that it can be supported by a staff level interpretation. So if we, I think we're just trying to get ahead of that, of where we could see that this would be something we would be able to move as an exemption, a by right exemption. But if the commission feels that, hey, we're not a little too uncertain about how this might work, an exception process, at least for an installation period, see how that works, see what the actual numbers are coming out to more regularly, that if we feel we can move it to an exemption after a certain point, we could also do that. But I think accommodating for this, as Alexi and I were talking, will be a project killer for some folks. So I think navigating and I think where Alexi and I we're kind of talking about that. Is it, and I can't remember our conversation full to maybe totally reiterate, but is where we're going to see this happening most is in the missing middle type level of products. Because the upgrades will likely at such a low scale not hit this, and at the high scale they'll already be doing it anyway. It's the projects that are right on the verge and probably have the least flexibility in percentages, penciling percentages, where this is gonna hit tight. So I think accommodating for this in some way within the ordinance makes a lot of sense, but moving it from exemption to exception, I think, like Alexi said, the exceptions process can be lengthy. Time is money, and we're trying to look how we can expedite and streamline things as much as possible. So maybe coming back to you with an option in this, but I think if we can get numbers that give planning commission some security, I think the exemption would be a great process to go through because of those administrative and streamlined elements. But if we're not feeling super clear on the full boundaries of that, the exceptions process may be the best to install initially.
Well, and part of me wonders, Corey, just because it is that middle zone, that kind of one, it's rare because the larger projects it's not really going to apply, and the smaller projects it's not really going to apply. And two, it's like how many projects in our neighborhoods are like part of me wonders or thinks that this would be infrequent enough that somebody would have to pursue an exception, that while of course streamlining processes and making them more efficient period is great, part of me just doesn't imagine that there are going to be very many developments a year that are going to have to go through this process, and therefore exception would make a lot of sense to me. But
that's hard to forecast.
oh yeah,
in my limited, again, bearing on our power grid, is I think we're at a build out scenario with our power capacities where I do think 4plexes to 6plex, again, in our keeping this in frame of where our title code or land use code update is going to be, is this idea of additionally creating more opportunity for when we're talking about multi-household units. We basically have a 3 units to 6 units metric, and then a 7 units full, plus metric. Very different standards. What I think we're trying to do is make units 3 to 6, or maybe even 3 to 4, wherever it is, very streamlined. Slight increases in requirements between the 3 to 5 and the 6 to 8 units, wherever that threshold lives, where we're really trying to, I think, advance that because of land size, because of those. We want to incentivize with bonuses of development those types of projects, given the types of parcels we have. Anyway, bigger projects are a different realm. I guess what I'm getting at is I think our infrastructure in power grid, where these transformer elements are going to become a bigger factor, where we're opening up the zoning for more dense development. I actually think we are going to hopefully with these updates see more development, more density coming in, where this missing middle piece of density is going to be something we're hopefully seeing more and more of. And my understanding of our infrastructure is it's already kind of set for the lower density that we're already at. So My hope is we're actually going to see a lot of them, would be my hope, because that means we're upgrading our infrastructure and we're upgrading our housing stock and density. So
Okay.
I could see it going both ways. I think to your point, we're pretty built out, and unless we do some dramatic adjustments into a number of areas of the code, I think you're right. It would probably be few and far between.
Yeah, well, and I think some of that depends on like how ready a lot of the transformers on our grid already are.
Mhm.
And to that, I cannot speak. So
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, part of the way this came up was Barry was trying to run numbers on some permits. He was afraid if they had to install EV charging and tripping this type of expense.
and this is only when the expense of, or essentially, it's not when the upgrade of the property period requires a transformer upgrade. It's when the EV readiness part trips that
Yeah.
transformer upgrade.
Yeah, the difference between their original plan and having to add capacity for EVs is what creates a transformer upgrade greater than 5% of their whole project.
Sure. Part of me wonders if there's any precedent for that 5% in any other city's code or otherwise, but
Interesting to
that's
find
my
out.
only other, like, just because
Mhm.
it's hard to judge.
Alexa's
Right.
been getting a lot of, you're not pulling you're not pulling this out of the ether.
Right.
A lot
Right.
of things. So I imagine if it was, it would be
Right.
something you'd come across.
Mhm.
Yeah, and we are coming back with this with other things. We'll keep looking for anything to target that more specifically.
The only other plug I might make really quick is that we did discuss different metric options, and I think the percentage rate was the most scalable and made the most sense because we talked
Yep.
about, oh, if it hits, this size residential transformer is going to be $10,000. Well, that's a lot. So if we
Yep.
say, oh, it's for this particular project, so we were using some of those scalable metrics where that percentage rate became scalable as we're talking about some of these middle-sized projects, um, even all the way up to, of course, larger projects, but it kept it in perspective. Because again, that's what we see. If we had hit static metrics, we would be short end of the stick, good end of the stick for a lot of folks. You'd be just on either side of that line, but this would keep it scalable, I think. Which it doesn't sound like that's in contest. I think we're all comfortable with that. But yeah, finding maybe where that percentage from some cost scenario examples might live, and we can get a sense of that, what we feel, and maybe reach out to some stakeholders of the community of somewhat agreeing. I think anytime we're adding cost, people are not going to be happy. But when it becomes a project killer, that's what we're really trying to exempt. If it's a project killer, we should not be interfering with projects to that scale. So that's what the attempt is here. Um, so not letting people off the hook, but like if this is going to truly, to Miles, your point, disincentivize doing a project, well, that's a problem.
Yeah. Certain.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Just flagging that it is after 8. If we
Yeah.
want to move on, this is just a discussion item. Make sure we give
think-
Alexi good direction, but also.
Yeah, I think we.
Yeah, I think we answered more or less the last question, but it was, we have it structured the same way that all exceptions would come to the planning commission. And then the question on this one was just, is that the way we want to keep this? Being is that in the landscape code, you've received a number of exceptions for similar types of issues with primarily trees and driveways. So is that something we want to maintain in this code is the question.
I think the process that we've used works well. We've done it several times now with the
Mhm.
landscaping ordinance, and I do think it allows some objectivity on top of enough subjectivity that at least we're creating a really good record that we can be consistent from request to request. I think that's really what my
Agreed. Yeah.
feeling is.
Certain.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's especially helpful in, kind of a new and trial period, and it doesn't have to stay that way forever, but like I said, can help set precedent and give us a better sense of what's actually coming in front of us and how we can write a better code to account for all of those situations.
All right. Well, thank you for your feedback. That's enough to work off of to come back with more complete draft. And I'll look into some of the questions and refine some of those numbers. Thank you.
See, thanks for all your work on this.
Yeah.
Really
Thank
impressive.
you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, rounding off the evening, future agenda items. What do we have?
Again.
Moved. I don't have anything submitted. I've got some hunches, but I never know when people are gonna submit things. Yeah, perhaps a landscape exception,
Okay,
perhaps.
Mhm.
Yeah. Corey, do you remember anything that might be coming up?
I think I'm in the same boat as you, where I think there's a number of projects we're handling right now, but nothing that I think is teed up and ready at the moment that I'm aware of.
that is fine and a good lead off to my final comment, which is that I will be unable to make the next scheduled planning commission meeting. So just a note for others, I will be
Out of graduation.
Oh, is it
It's
graduation night?
Mhm.
Should we preemptively cancel that, Corey?
So I have a lot.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
even as we sit now with both of you, that would be a quorum issue. So I think we would say we have a conflict for quorum where we may just plan on pushing to the following meeting if there are any agenda items that come up. So yes, I think we can accommodate that.
Would be
All right, great.
fabulous.
Okay.
Need one more.
I know. Speaking of that, I did see that the city has pushed out another call for
I
applications.
saw that.
I've
So glad.
shared that where I can.
Yep.
Have we heard if the mayor has received anything or not? Okay.
Oh.
People, join the planning commission. It's fun. We have a great time.
Exactly.
It's a good crew. You can attend remotely if you need to.
Mhm.
All right. Thanks, everybody. I will adjourn the meeting at 8:12 p.m.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have fun at the conference, Corey.
Thank
Bye.
you.